The Alienware AW2721D is arguably one of the best gaming monitors that I've come across, and I've reviewed in excess of 180 different monitors, and I'm someone who'd consider themselves as a relatively hardcore competitive gamer, having shoved over 2,000 hours on competitive Counter-Strike. Now, the Alienware monitor can be found for around £650 to £700 in the UK and is roughly around $800 in the US. Now, if you're interested in purchasing it, the links in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store, and also you should see some of the alternatives that you might want to consider, including the likes of, for example, the Samsung Odyssey G7, which I reviewed not too long ago, and that is equally a very impressive 240Hz 1440p gaming monitor. Now, before jumping into this detailed review, if you have Instagram or Twitter, I'd very much appreciate a follow, and if you're interested in keeping up with the latest news or reviews on electric or hybrid vehicles, do check out Totally EV. I'm effectively doing a new car review every single week on the platform, and it goes without saying, if you want to keep up with the channel itself, definitely do subscribe and hit that bell notification. It's greatly appreciated. So to kick things off, let me give you a quick brief overview in terms of the specs of the monitor. It's a 27-inch, 240Hz, 1440p IPS monitor. It also runs at a quoted response time of 1 millisecond. It also has a built-in G-Sync module. It has HDR 600 certification, which is pretty impressive. And furthermore, it's got DisplayPort and HDMI inputs and a 3.5mm jack output for your headphones, and you've also got a USB hub. In other words, you've got two USB 3.2 ports in order for you to plug in your peripherals if you want directly into the monitor. Now, a small little point in terms of display inputs, this monitor does not support a 4K scaling. In other words, it can't take a 4K input, let's say from a console, and downscale it to 1440p. Now, this is a potential issue for PlayStation users, because those people who are on PlayStation, you might be aware that you cannot get 1440p natively, and therefore you would need a monitor that takes 4K signal and downscales it to 1440p. And in this respect, this monitor does not do it. I tried it on my 4K Blu-ray player and it simply would output 1080p. If, however, you have an Xbox, then you will be able to use 1440p. Now, moving on, we've got the design of the monitor, and here I'm actually quite a fan of it because the monitor has got a four-sided borderless design, which is quite a rarity nowadays. It seems like specifically for gaming monitors, you don't really often see that. And furthermore, its stand is extremely sturdy. Actually, is quite a hefty stand, by the way. It's in comparison to other monitors I've reviewed, I found it to be quite chunky, but in this respect it means that the monitor is very sturdy on your desk. And furthermore, you've got a full array of customization. In other words, you've got height, tilt, pivot, and you can swivel it around as well. So in other words, you've got everything to your heart's content. And of course, if you don't want to use a stand, or indeed you're going to be using it in a multi-monitor setup, you can do so via its VESA compatibility. So jumping into the OSD, you've got a few different modes. Now, first off, in terms of the preset modes, this is to do with the different colors. I actually prefer it in terms of its standard mode, and you also see a little asterisk over there, which means that it's for display HDR as well. You've got custom color as well, where it allows you to adjust the RGB values. Game Enhanced mode isn't exactly what it says, you might think it says. It's actually just a few different options that you have. In terms of response time, we're going to touch upon this in the gaming section of this review, but in my case, I'll flick between super fast or extreme mode. You've got black stabilizer and then the variable backlight. Now, these modes, the 0, 1 and 2, get enabled by default when you're running an HDR signal. In SDR, however, you'll probably want to have it disabled in order for you to get, so I would say, the best sort of color accuracy. Now, in terms of the brightness and contrast, ignore the brightness level, that's just for my camera to pick it up, and contrast at 75. Input sources, as the name might suggest. Alien FX lighting, now you've got those RGB lights which you can customize, and you can enable them via all zones or not, and this will enable it, let's say, on the power LED, and then at the back as well, as the names might suggest, and you can change the colors, and also even have a spectrum, almost like an RGB kind of wave spectrum. In my case, I don't see the point of having any sort of light on a monitor, so I always have them disabled. Then you've got the audio, that's via the 3.5mm jack. Then you've got the menu system, as the name might suggest again. You can personalize the shortcut keys, but it's a shame that you don't have, let's say, the overdrive mode, which is listed over here, so it's a little bit limited in that respect. And then in terms of the other, you've got some display information and then the firmware that you're running, as you can see over here, the mode that I'm running at. And now we get on to image quality. Now the monitor has a 1440p IPS panel, and when I put it in terms of my color calibrator, I was looking to see how it would do in terms of out-of-the-box performance in comparison to the sRGB standard, because that's the web format. Now here it scored a staggering 99.8% in the sRGB coverage and 149.8%. You will also able to see that it's got a wide color gamut. In other words, it hits the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 standards pretty well. Now in comparison to the sRGB standard, it does exceed it. However, when it comes to color accuracy, as you might have seen via the OSD, there's no dedicated sRGB mode. It means that Delta E is stuck to an average of 2.63 and a maximum of 5.66, with a contrast ratio of a respectable 1033 to 1. Now what this means is that if you're going to be using it for color editing or video grading, you should be just aware in terms of its sRGB color accuracy. If you have a color calibrator at hand, then you might want to calibrate the monitor before you're actually using it for professional work. However, for gamers out there which are not going to be using it for editing per se, you will find that the monitor's colors just really pop. In comparison to the likes of the Samsung Odyssey G7, which opts for a VA panel instead, this monitor will look far superior to the naked eye, while a calibrator might seem that it's pretty much identical, at least on paper. What I'm trying to say over here is that aside from the obvious, in other words the IPS viewing angles that you get, the colors just really pop. They just look nice, they don't look washed out, and to me, I personally think an IPS panel in this domain really does stand out in comparison to VA or indeed TN panels on the market. Now on a more negative note, the brightness uniformity wasn't too great, at least on my panel. It's a bit panel lottery, but here it was slightly disappointing to see that the monitor just didn't do well throughout the board. Now as for backlight bleed, it is an IPS panel, and here again it does suffer in comparison to its VA or TN counterparts, and it just wasn't as good throughout the panel itself. So in this respect, this was definitely one of its weakest points. However, one of its strongest points was actually the overall brightness that it gets to. And here I had it tested in terms of its SDR brightness at 530 nits, while its lowest is around 44 nits. Now you might be thinking, wait, this is a Display HDR 600 certified monitor. Now as I mentioned before, if you were paying attention, I wasn't able to plug in my 4K Blu-ray player, and that's how I normally do my HDR testing, specifically when it comes to peak brightness. So as a result, it meant that I couldn't test peak brightness. However, when you look out there on the internet, so for example, if we take Simon's review from TFT Central, which is, by the way, shout out to Simon, he does great reviews, and in case you don't know TFT Central, you should definitely check it out. You'll be able to see that he had it tested at 627 or 630 odd nits. In other words, surpassing the HDR standard. Now what I can say is that from my own experience, having used the monitor, it's extremely bright, and when you look at an HDR signal through it, in other words, when I was playing Destiny 2 on it, what I found is the monitor really did pop in terms of the overall colors and the way it could deal with the contrast. Now moving past that, we've got NVIDIA G-Sync. Now unlike many monitors which use AMD FreeSync and indeed have, let's say, compatibility with NVIDIA G-Sync, this actually has a G-Sync module built in, which actually does impact in terms of overall input lag, and we'll touch upon that in just a bit. But in terms of its G-Sync range, it's flawless. It means it's got a 1 to 240 Hz VRR range, meaning that you get a fantastic buttery smooth experience no matter the amount of FPS that you're outputting via your GPU, and effectively means that you're getting the best G-Sync experience that you can have. Now I was testing it via an RTX 2080 Super connected over DisplayPort. You can of course connect it over HDMI if you so wish, as it has a built-in built-in G-Sync module, and therefore you can utilize this. Now for AMD FreeSync owners, you'll just have to be mindful in terms of what you can actually have. You can have AMD FreeSync support, but it's limited. In other words, it's kind of the role reversal with NVIDIA G-Sync and FreeSync. In other words, you will need a DisplayPort cable as well. So just kind of be mindful of that. Now in terms of HDR, 1440p and G-Sync running simultaneously, I had no issues in this domain either, something that some people ask in terms of if you can run them all simultaneously. Yes you can, and well, I had no issues whatsoever. Now while all of this is good, the most important part for me was actually competitive gaming. As I mentioned at the beginning of this review, I've reviewed over 180 monitors and have played over 2,000 hours of competitive Counter-Strike, and I wanted to see if this IPS monitor was actually living up to to the billing. And I am very pleased to say that it is absolutely spectacular when it comes to competitive gaming. I would potentially say it's a little bit better than the Odyssey G7, but it has its pros and cons. Now, first off, in terms of input lag, because it's got that built-in G-Sync module, it means that you're getting a fantastically low input lag, to the point where it's almost non-existent. And from my experience of having used other IPS panels, be it with G-Sync modules or not, I can safely say that this is among one of the best when it comes to input lag, period, let alone ones that are actually using an IPS panel. Now, in terms of response time, it's a slightly different matter. And the reason I say that is because it depends in terms of your overdrive setting that you use. Now, you've got three modes to choose from. You've got fast, super fast, and extreme. Now, in terms of the extreme mode, if you're playing something like Counter-Strike, you will notice a little bit of inverse ghosting, and that might throw you off when you're taking your shots. So for example, if you're an opper and you have a relatively high sensitivity, if you're going to be flicking from different scenes, you might find that little bit of inverse ghosting, well, just a tad off-putting. In my case, I didn't find it too off-putting, but it did cause a little bit of strain on my eyes, and it meant that on the whole I felt that the extreme mode was just a little step too far for this panel. So as a result, using it on its super fast mode kind of yielded the best sort of experience. You're not getting too much inverse ghosting, and while you're still getting a very responsive panel. Does this mean that you can use it for competitive gaming? Absolutely. In terms of its response time, it is fantastic. Even if you are dialing it even on its fast overdrive mode setting, it's still very, very fast in terms of how it responds with different scenes. If you're a competitive gamer, I would urge you to go for super fast, or indeed if your eyes can cater for it, go to the extreme mode. So here is where it kind of falls short in comparison to the Odyssey G7, where its Samsung counterpart effectively could run on almost any overdrive setting and have low motion blur mode enabled, and therefore mean that you're getting low motion blur because of the VA panel, and then getting a fantastically great response time without any inverse ghosting, whereas the same couldn't be said about this Dell Alienware, or the Alienware monitor. I say Dell because they're part of the same company, but anyway, all I'm trying to say over here is that you should be bearing in mind some of its pros and cons. Now, as for the refresh rate, it runs at 240 Hz. It means that you can get a buttery smooth experience. Is it something that you should be considering over 144 Hz? Well, I've done actually quite a detailed breakdown between that. As someone who is quite a competitive gamer, I personally don't see too much of a gain between 144 Hz and 240 Hz. But if you're someone who's going to be really utilizing those extra frames, then of course you're going to be someone who wants something like this. So this leads me on to my verdict. Should you be buying this Alienware monitor? Well, let's break it down. The pros. You've got fantastic popping colors. While they're not exactly strictly color accurate, you've got a wide color gamut to choose from. You've got 240 Hz running at 1440p. You've got a 27-inch monitor that has got a beautiful build quality and stand, which gives you all the adjustments that you want. You've got a comprehensive OSD, and furthermore, you've got low input lag and a decent response time. And furthermore, you've got a fantastic VRR range thanks to a built-in G-Sync module. On the flip side, it's expensive. It is more expensive than its counterparts out there on the market. It is also not exactly the best in terms of response time, because when you dial it in terms of its extreme overdrive, you get a bit inverse ghosting, and that might throw you off in terms of competitive gaming, or let's say more casual gaming. So as a result, you might think twice about it. And it also doesn't take a 4K signal for those people who are going to be using it side by side with their PC and let's say a console, namely the PlayStation 5 or PlayStation whatever it might be. So there are some pros and cons, but despite the cons, I think the pros outweigh. And in this respect, in my opinion, I think this monitor deserves a Best Buy award because it competes like for like with the Odyssey G7 and ultimately is potentially one of the best gaming monitors that you can buy out there, specifically if money is not an object. Now that's just my opinions and thoughts about it, but of course I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Now if you like this video and want to see more unbiased, independent reviews from the channel, give it a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification. And if you feel that this video will be helpful to a family and friend making an informed purchasing decision, then of course share it across social media or via email or wherever you're going to share it via. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it, and of course take care of yourselves and goodbye.